second part of our conference. Session 1, Hopes. Chair of this session is Dr. Kamil Kijek. It is my great pleasure to see you. Hello, Kamil. Kamil Kijek is assistant professor at the Judaic Studies Department, University of Wrocław. His scholarly interests include the problems of contemporary politics and Jewish awareness in the 20th century, especially in East Central Europe and the Middle East, as well as traditional relations between Jewish communities in the above-mentioned regions and in North America. He is also interested in political modernism, political violence, and the relation between social theory, political history, and social and cultural history. He is an author of many very interesting articles and papers. I would like to say that he is an author of very interesting and very famous book Dzieci modernizmu, świadomość, kultura i socjalizacja polityczna młodzieży żydowskiej w międzywojennej Polsce. It was published 1 year ago. Kamil, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Artur. It is my honor to chair a panel on which there are 3 of my unofficial but very important mentors and 1 scholar that I am an ardent reader of. So it is a pleasure and an honor to present the speakers, and I will start with the presentation of the first speaker, Natalia Aleksiun, who is associate professor at Graduate School of Modern Jewish History at Touro College in New York, and Natalia is author of a very important book on Zionism in post-war Poland, editor of 2 volumes of POLIN, and she kind of simultaneously prepares 3 very advanced already book projects on Jewish historians in inter Poland, on so-called Cadaver Affair, which is a very important comment addition to the history of anti-Semitism and Polish-Jewish relations in inter Poland, and a fascinating book on Holocaust, gender, and Polish-Jewish-Ukrainian relations in Galicia. Our second speaker will be Professor Joshua Zimmerman, who is Associate Professor in History and Chair of Holocaust and Eastern European Studies at Yeshiva University in New York. And Professor Zimmerman is an author of 2 also very fascinating books. One is about PPS and Bunt relations in pre-1914 Polish lands. Second recent book is about the Polish underground and the Jews during the Second World War. And also author of 2 very important edited volumes. And also regarding the topic of our conversation, I know as a PhD student, I heard the gossip that you are working on a book on Piłsudski and the Jews. Yeah. You've prepared just 1 article, but I hope also that you'll be part of the discussions about the books of another scholars who work on this topic now. So it's fascinating also for our today's conversation. Our first speaker will be Professor Marko Zilber, who is Associate Professor in Jewish History Department at the Haifa University and until very recently the Dean of the department. Marko is the author of very important monography on Jewish politics and autonomy during the First World War, and also author of scores of articles and studies on Polish-Jewish relations and also on ambivalence of Jewish and Polish belonging and citizenship in interwar, in First World War, and also in post-Holocaust Poland, but so I think also it will very much contribute our discussion. And finally, last and not least, is Professor David Engel, Professor of Holocaust Studies of Modern Jewish History and of History at New York University. At home, I have counted 7 books of yours that I know. Now I see that there are 8 books, that 6 of them you wrote and 2 of them you have edited. I will not mention all of them, but in general, they concern Polish-Jewish relations during the Holocaust itself, history of Zionism, Jewish-Ukrainian relations in the case of Petlura and Shalom Schwarzbart, and of course also Bricha and the reconstruction of Jewish lives in first months and years after the Holocaust in Poland. And we'll proceed in the following that I will ask all the speakers to give their talks, and then we follow with the discussion. We'll collect questions, then we will ask you to answer. Of course, there will be presentations, commentary of Professor Engel, and then the questions in sets. So Natalia, please start.
Thank you, Kamil. Thank you for including me in this already interesting conversation, and to make it even more exciting for myself, I lost the file with my presentation, which was now found. So I'm going to be catching my breath. So going back to the round table discussion that opened our conference, citing a little bit of what Maciej Zakrocki said, that this is a complicated story in complicated times, I want to bring to the table the Galician chapter of the complicated story. In 1914, Elias Rotner ran away from his hometown to Vienna, or as he wrote in his brief account, the capital of the country of which I was a citizen at the time. He was born in 1898 in Stryj, in eastern Galicia, raised in Kołomyja, and I'll continue using Polish geographic terms, and from an early age was driven by his strong interest in intellectual pursuits. In Vienna, Rotner worked by day and studied by night, and eventually graduated with distinction from a gymnasium. Drafted in 1917, he fought as a soldier of the Habsburg Empire until the end of the war. In his testimony written in 1945, Rotner reflected briefly on the role of German language in his youth. He fondly recalled reading books translated into German and Polish, feeling at home in both Polish and German, as well as in Jewish literature. He still mourned the loss of the beloved books he had to leave behind when he returned from Germany to Poland after Hitler's rise to power. And he's writing after the Holocaust. This is still a traumatic event for him. Rotner structured his autobiographical account of his life as shaped in equal measure by his love of philosophy and literature, as well as by dramatic ruptures caused by anti-Jewish violence and persecution. His seemingly overlapping cultural identities, combined with his continued attachment to his library, helped to bridge the repeated relocations and dramatic circumstances of his life. Based on fragmentary sources, personal accounts, such as Rotner's testimony, newspaper articles, and official statements made by Jewish representatives, I want to discuss today the ways in which Galician Jews reflected on their relationship with the emerging Polish state. These accounts concern individuals both born in various places and with diverse experiences, united by similar ethnic, class, and regional backgrounds. Specifically, they come primarily from Galician Jews who grew up in families with enough means to send their children, mainly men in the case of my examples, to gymnasia and even universities. While not all of them belonged to the upper middle class, most had a relatively affluent background, although there is one Hasidic family. Thus, class played a role in shaping their linguistic milieu and their cultural and political aspirations. Lastly, the analysis focuses on the cultural references of two generational cohorts: Jews born and raised in Galicia before the outbreak of the First World War and Jews who came of age in the Second Polish Republic. So they were sort of reflecting back on the moment of great political shift of 1918 for themselves and for their parents' generation. I will explore personal and communal Jewish texts through the lens of the history of emotions. On the eve of Poland's resurrection, Galician Jews constituted an emotional community, a social community bound by its shared experience before and during the First World War. Following historian Barbara Rosenwein's formulation, I'll seek to uncover, this is a quote, systems of feeling to establish what these communities and the individuals within them define and assess as valuable or harmful to them, for it is about such things that people express emotions. The emotions that they value, devalue, and ignore, the nature of the affective bonds between people that they recognize, and the modes of emotional expression that they expect, encourage, tolerate, or deplore, end of quote. Galician Jews, as a community of emotions, shared their positive experience under the Austrian rule on the one hand, and the fear and vulnerability that accompanied the revival of Poland's statehood on the other hand. So firstly, the Galician paradigm relied on cultural flexibility in which German language and Habsburg heritage continued to be an important part of their cultural repertoire. Elias Rotner represents many Jewish men and women who are fluent in Polish, and in fact, Galician Jews always serve as this example of a community on the eve of Poland's independence that is deeply shaped by Polish language and culture and knowledgeable of Polish history, but he also represents a community that is fluent in German, Yiddish, Hebrew, and Ukrainian, and who used different languages in various contexts, but who reflected on their and their family's relationship with German and their formative years before the First World War. For them, German-speaking Vienna continued to represent greater economic and cultural opportunities, as well as more prestige and status. In Skała, it was believed that Vienna was the most beautiful city in the world. Hone Gottesman humorously remembered in his account of coming of age in eastern Galicia on the eve of World War I. During the First War, thousands of Galician Jews fled to Vienna, which exerted a powerful attraction for many Jews as an almost mystical place of beauty and limitless opportunity governed by a benevolent monarch. After their relocation to the capital, Jewish men and women were educated in German as well as one of their primary languages, alongside Yiddish, Polish, and Hebrew. They studied, married, began their professional careers there. In Vienna, many Galician Jews underwent process of acculturation while retaining a sense of religious and cultural distinctiveness, and we kept on coming back to this duality in the first discussion. Some memoirs of Jews who came of age in Galicia during and shortly after the war, but whose families had Galician roots, discussed their cultural ambivalence towards East European Jews who become Polish Jews, including their own relatives. For Galician Jews, the German language formed part of their subjective cultural reality, including a distinctive set of myths and meanings. This is not to downplay the fact that other languages, especially Polish, also played a vital role. Indeed, some Galician Jews continued their relationship with German culture of the Habsburg variation, their intimate knowledge of the German language, and their nostalgia for the Habsburg monarchy. Testimonies and memoirs offer us nostalgic vignettes, which often display an intimate relationship with German language and culture in the Austro-Hungarian variety. This affinity continued as Galician Jews became citizens of the Second Polish Republic. The collapse of the Austria-Hungary in the immediate aftermath of the First World War led to a power vacuum, which formed the backdrop of Polish and Ukrainian political and territorial claims to the region, and a wave of anti-Jewish violence that swept across eastern Galicia and to a lesser extent also western Galicia. This worsening political situation undoubtedly increased the longing of the Galician Jews for the better times under Habsburg rule. Elias Rotner, who worked at an agricultural school on a estate in Słobódka Leśna near Kołomyja, preparing to enter a program in agronomy, remembered surviving a pogrom committed by Polish soldiers passing through the area on its way back to the motherland, as he puts it, from the Soviet Ukraine, which was supported by the reactionary elements in Kołomyja. This is a quote. Rotner was one of the very few survivors among his friends and colleagues at the agricultural school. The experience of the pogrom traumatized him and drove him first to Czernowitz in Bukowina, where he studied philosophy, and then to Germany, where he attempted to continue his intellectual pursuits. The spate of violence across the region, and especially the bloody pogrom of November 18 in Lwów, fueled Galician Jews' fears of the future while reinforcing the symbolic meaning of the Habsburg monarchy for the Jews. The vivid memory of life under Habsburg rule, whether experienced in the empire's capital or in Galicia, appears as a recurrent motif in memories and testimonies of the young generation of Jews who couldn't remember it, born during and after First World War. They recall these attitudes as central to the worldview and political culture of their parents and grandparents. Michael Goldman-Gilad, born in Katowice in 1925, remembered the nostalgia with which his parents and grandparents, who grew up in small towns and villages near Przemyśl, spoke about the Emperor Franz Joseph and the Habsburg monarchy. His parents remembered the emperor as liberal and friendly to the Jews. His mother, moreover, used to sing about the beauty of Vienna. Yet, fondness for Franz Joseph and fluency in German did not exclude acculturation into Polish culture and language for their son. Born Matilda Hirsch to an Orthodox middle-class family in Kołomija, Maria Rosenblum described her parents' close relationship with German culture. Her father, Samuel, was a Vishnitzer Hasid who owned a successful flatware store selling porcelain, enamel, and glasswares, also to Polish nobility. Her mother, Pepi, came from the capital city of Bukowina, Czernowitz, and felt pride in her German cultural roots. For both of her parents, German culture and language continued to serve as a primary point of reference, connecting them to the memory of Habsburg Austria. For them, it signified, as the daughter says, the best part of their lives. They shared their worldview with their children, the last generation of Jews who had come of age in the Habsburg Empire. But their youngest daughter, Matilda, or Maria, grew up in the Polish Republic. In her recollections, she compared her own identity with that of her older sisters, who still, I quote, who still had a background of Habsburg Austria. In 1916, the family fled from Kołomija because of the war and spent time in Sziget, which belonged to Austro-Hungary, until the area was ceded to Romania in 1920. When the Hirsch family returned to Galicia, they suddenly found that they were no longer inhabitants of the empire, but part of the Polish Republic. It should come as no surprise that for the Hirsches, their two older daughters, their Habsburg Austrian cultural identity continued beyond the collapse of the empire and the tectonic geopolitical shifts engendered by the First World War. The family tried to adjust to the new political reality. The framework of ethnicization and ethnic conflict at the end of the First World War and the rebirth of Polish independent statehood made the multiple cultural loyalty practiced by the Hirsches extremely difficult, if not dangerous. Jews could easily be accused of a lack of loyalty and blamed as anti-Polish, and they were. In a symbolic scene, sometime in 1920, the Hirsches took down the picture of former Austrian Emperor Franz Joseph in the living room and replaced it with the picture of Marshal Józef Piłsudski, the political leader, and I'm happy to give the footnote, the political leader and symbol of the Second Polish Republic. Rosenblum believed that her parents did this for the children's sake. Ostensibly, they wanted to make them fit in and instill in them this new loyalty. Rather than ending the nostalgia for Galicia under Habsburg rule, or what historian Robert Wistrich called the civil religion of dynastic patriotism, the decision to switch the portraits was a survival strategy. Piłsudski's portrait served to prove the family's loyalty under the new regime. How can we define the cultural identity of the Hirsches family right after the First World War, and how did their relationship with the German language and their heritage of Austro-Hungary continue to unfold as Polish state took over. Historian Larry Wolff has argued for the continued existence of Galicia without the Habsburg monarchy. What he calls Galicia after Galicia is a phantom existence in the mindsets of the region's inhabitants under the previous sovereignties. Wolff explained, and I quote, "Whether they stayed at home or migrated across the ocean, some of the former Galicians would maintain their Galician identity as Galician Ukrainians, Galician Poles, and especially as Galician Jews, who constituted an ethnographic category of their own, Galicianer." End of quote. The Hirsches may have taken the portrait of Franz Josef down from the place of honor in their house. Nevertheless, positive memories of life under the Austro-Hungarian rule and the respect for German culture shaped the life of many Jews in the early years of the Second Polish Republic. They saw themselves not just as Polish citizens, but also as Galician Jews. At the same time, the complex mental landscape of personal memories, cultural sensitivities, and political associations seems to have been strongly conditioned by generational differences. For the generation who came of age in Habsburg Austria, this past continued to play an important emotional role as they felt nostalgic for the life before the First World War. And then to the second part, the patriotic part. A sense of fear and vulnerability permeates institutional responses to Poland's revival in Galicia. From the late 19th century, Jews sided generally with the Poles. With nationalism on the rise, Jews were in a precarious, increasingly difficult situation as a minority poised between Poles and Ukrainians. As a result, Jews declared neutrality when Poles and Ukrainians fought over Lwów in November 1918. But after the Poles concluded the conquest of the city, pogroms were perpetrated in Jewish neighborhoods, and Jews were punished for what was presented as backing a Ukrainian position. Jewish press in Galicia therefore reported that in Lwów, the violence was perpetrated by Polish military units accompanied by officers and unarmed civilians. And this presence of official Polish units was particularly important for the perception of what was happening. Jewish journalists and communal activists were alarmed by the fact that the state building was therefore linked to anti-Jewish violence and official justification for it. In one official annunciation, Jewish lawyer, communal activist, and municipal official, Tobiasz Ashkenazy, who took the leadership over the Jewish Rescue Committee, or Żydowski Komitet Ratunkowy, after the pogrom, stated, and I think it's a very telling statement, as a Jew who has firmly stood at the side of the Polish banner since an early childhood, I address today, at this very difficult and serious moment, the whole society. I appeal to you to act and put a stop to the wave of destruction and to halt the wave of barbarity which has dominated Lwów. And he continues to say that he knows intimately, he's intimately familiar with the feelings and thoughts of Poles who are among his close friends, but now these Poles need to speak up against what is happening. And then comes the part that I think is particularly interesting from somebody who was associated as part of the so-called assimilationist camp. So he goes on to say that a huge mass of the Jewish people are not and do not want to be either Polish or Ruthenian. They are Jewish and want to remain Jewish. Consider just for a moment the entire monstrosity of their situation. I demand, in the name of all gods and people's laws, that the Jewish nation be recognized and that all of Jews in the country be granted the right to determine their own nationality. Apropos discussion we had again before, this is a sort of demand for recognition of Jewish separate status that comes in the wake in the aftermath of a violent pogrom. Ashkenazi's emotional suffering experienced as a Jew who aligned himself with the Polish intelligentsia and the Polish national cause reflects not only the emotions of an individual, but emotions that became instruments of sociability for a generation of Galician Jewish intelligentsia and their social interactions. Responding in the name of the academic association Unity Zjednoczenie in February 1919, Maurycy Karniol, who did fight in the legions and had a long history of supporting Polish national cause, referred to the, what he calls, red fog of Jewish blood, which covered the work of our entire idealistic youth, while the cold breeze of November excesses froze off our beloved ideals. So we have many people who go from very explicit association with Polish national causes to being profoundly traumatized by how they experience November 18 in Eastern Galicia and in Lwów in particular. Some of them shift to the new self-definition, some of them don't, but people like Victor Hayes, for example, still reminisce about 1918, fall 1918, in his 1930s memoir. Likewise, the Jewish press in Galicia was alarmed by the deterioration of legal status of Jews by practices that would be unthinkable under Austrian rule. Under the title Metryka Chrztu, baptismal record, it reported, for example, that in Kraków, the Polish press began publishing announcements about employment opportunities reserved only to Catholics. In a rather bold move, it called on the still valid Austrian law and official declarations from Warsaw that the new state would give equal rights to all its citizens regardless of religion and nationality. This new practice was an act of lawlessness and in stark contrast to the rule of law in Habsburg Galicia. So it asked, will it be allowed in the new Polish state to publicly commit lawless acts? We read in Nowy Dziennik in November 1918. So it contrasted old Austrian rule, which was gone, but it still was associated with equality, with practices that would not be possible, and this new rule that emerged that seemed more threatening than promising to the Jewish public. Same goes for responding to accusations about Jewish aligning with partitioning powers over the 150 years of Poland's partitions. And in the case of Galicia, Jewish press wrote about it somewhat ironically, that plenty of Poles had been participating in Austrian rule over Galicia, and yet they are not accused of this double loyalty in the past. For scholars of East European Jewish history, the Jewish community in Galicia on the eve of the First World War has often been described as deeply influenced by Polish culture, literature, and language due to its legal status and access to education. I'm also guilty of it. In contrast to other parts of the so-called borderlands, one could expect a degree of patriotic fervor on the eve of Poland's resurrection. But close reading of personal statements and official annunciations in and about the fall of 1918 reveal a much more complex and ambivalent picture. For Galician Jews, November 1918 was a collective traumatic experience. Their complex cultural identity proved a disadvantage in the emerging nation-state. Fluent in German and with close ties to German culture before and during the First World War, they found themselves marginalized and threatened. Even those who were not directly affected by violence experienced emotional suffering. November 1918 became more a trigger for a shared experience of fear and insecurity, a fertile ground for the memories of a marginal emotional community. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you very much. My talk today is about a camp for interned Jewish soldiers in August and September 1920. Let me begin, please. On August 9th, 1920, as the Red Army was approaching the gates of Warsaw and Europe teetered on the brink of war, 34-year-old General Kazimierz Stosunkowski was named Minister of Military Affairs in the coalition government under Vicente Vitos. 1 week later, on August 16th, the day Pilsudski launched a bold counteroffensive, General Kazimierz Stosunkowski issued a notorious order to intern Jewish soldiers and officers and volunteers of the Polish army at a camp in the town of Jabłonna, located 14 miles northwest of Warsaw. The order called for the removal of Jews from army offices and military formations due to, quote, the continuous increase in cases testifying to the harmful activities of the Jewish element, unquote. This order from Poland's second highest military authority, Pilsudski was commander-in-chief of the armed forces, this order was a stinging rebuke, amounting to what the late Jerzy Tomaszewski characterized as, quote, a scandal with great meaning, unquote. On the day the order was issued, the Jewish Parliamentary Club, made up of Jewish members of the parliament linked to the Zionist parties, expressed their outrage in a letter to General Stosunkowski. Quote, we cannot comprehend, the letter stated, why Jews in the army are treated in this way while, at the same time, they are accused of a lack of patriotism and of an unwillingness to sacrifice their blood for the defense of the Polish state. The order to intern Jewish soldiers demonstrates that while the military authorities are not in favor of the participation of Jews in the army, but rather strive in all ways, contrary to the principles of equality of rights, to remove Jews from military formations and to impose on them conditions worse than their Christian soldiers, unquote. The letter continued, letter continued that the order, quote, makes the predicament of the Jewish element difficult at the present moment. It intensifies and fuels an anti-Jewish atmosphere and may lead to unprecedented consequences, unquote. On August 19th, the Jewish Parliamentary Club sent another letter to General Stosunkowski arguing that, quote, such orders instill a conviction that Jews are enemies of the state. Now, on August 18th, meanwhile, the Council for the Defense of the State, Rada Ochrony Państwa, held a session at which the Jabłonna camp for Jewish soldiers was discussed. Those present included Chief of State Józef Pilsudski, Prime Minister Vicente Vitos, Minister of War Stosunkowski, and Deputy Prime Minister Ignacy Daszyński. According to the protocols, the council was briefed on Stosunkowski's order, and then the council was read out loud the protest letter by the Jewish Parliamentary Club, which demanded the immediate closing of the camp. Daszyński supported the Jewish demand. The protocols named council members who weighed in on the discussion. Notably silent was Pilsudski, an indication that he likely supported or never voiced his opposition to Stosunkowski's order. More evidence of Pilsudski's likely support are his comments at a second discussion that very day of the council. When the subject of Jews in the Polish army came up, Pilsudski, who's noted not by name but in the protocols as the commandant, commander of the armed forces, is recorded as having said the following, quote, to pollute the divisions on the front with Jews is bad. and to send them to the battle units is also bad. In 9/10 of the time, Jews who desert go to the Bolshevik side, unquote. Needless to say, the result of the discussion was that the council decided to keep the order in place. Excuse me. Now, Pilsudski's views were made public in a more sanitary way in an interview he gave to Kurier Poranina on August 26th, the 10th day of the Polish counteroffensive and the 10th day of the existence of the camp itself. When asked about Jewish soldiers in the Polish army, Pilsudski began with a positive note. Quote, Jews did not behave poorly everywhere. In Łomża and in Mazovia, they bravely held back the Bolshevik advance. In Mazovia, many Jewish soldiers died in defending the state, unquote. Now, Pilsudski then added, however, quote, on the other hand, not far away, in Łuków, in Siedlce, in Białystok, and further away, in Włodawa, and sometimes even on a mass scale, could be found treason from the Jewish side, unquote. Now, 4 days later, after the interview with Pilsudski appeared, the Jewish press reported, the first press reports came out about the Jabłonna camp. On September 1st, 1920, a Polish newspaper printed a first-hand account from a reporter who had visited the Jabłonna camp on August 29th, titled The Riddle of Jabłonna. The account began by describing the camp. The reporter estimated that about 3,000 Jewish soldiers were present. Among the Jewish soldiers, the reporter continued, quote, were a great many volunteers, intellectuals, and academics plucked from the various branches of the Polish army. No one knows what is going on, unquote. Now, according to the article, those interned were not accused of any crime and, in fact, seemed to have the status of like prisoners. The writer supported his claim with the story that when he returned to Warsaw one day later, he visited 4 Jewish soldiers from the Jabłonna camp who needed medical attention unrelated to their internment. Quote, they are being treated like prisoners, unquote, the article stated. Now, subsequent press reports during the Jabłonna affair express more outrage. In the pages of Robotnik, the central organ of the Polish Socialist Party, excuse me, the Jabłonna camp was described as an egregious violation of Polish law. Quote, we do not yet have a constitution, Robotnik stated on September 4th, 1920, but we are obligated to uphold certain constitutional principles, without which we do not have a modern state. Equality of rights for all citizens without regard to religion and origin all exists in our country. Supposedly, our army is based on the principles of universal conscription and universal rights. Jabłonna is a mockery of this constitutional principle, unquote. In a dramatic appeal to shut down the camp, Robotnik concluded in the following manner, and I'm quoting from that article. Behold the Jewish soldiers who, 6 years ago, set out with Pilsudski and Stosunkowski into the field, now torn from the ranks and pilloried. Here is a soldier decorated with the cross of the Virtuti Militari, stigmatized as a candidate for treason. The volunteers who ran to the ranks when the fatherland called for help must now torment themselves in this purgatory of Jabłonna. Why? For no other reason than that they are Jews, unquote. In Lwów, meanwhile, the mouthpiece of the city's Jewish community, Chwila, their Polish language organ, covered the Jabłonna story on the same day. For 2 weeks, the newspaper stated, the soldiers have been interned in a camp for suspected spies. We can report that Jewish members of the parliament are intervening, but we have no news directly from the camp. And And this provincial hole in the wall is becoming the center of a sad legend, unquote. Now, press accounts combined with the vigorous efforts of the Jewish Parliamentary Club and their ally, Deputy Prime Minister Ignacy Dashinsky, who vigorously protested, led General Stosunkowski to dissolve the camp in Jabłonnie on September 9th, 1920, 25 days after it was established. Now, given the brevity of the camp's establishment, the press coverage was limited, but in addition to press accounts, we have accounts of those who visited the camp. For example, when one of the above mentioned articles, in one of the above mentioned articles, the first one that was published on September 1st, when that came out, the camp, the reporter said that he came away with the impression that the Jews were humiliated and they felt shamed. But he adds this quote, "But rumors that conditions in Jabłonna are particularly bad are groundless," unquote. That was what the reporter stated on September 1st. Now, so the question is, what were conditions in this camp? Conditions seemed to, from studying this camp, to dramatically change in the next few weeks after that reporter reported on September 29th. For example, one of the members of parliament, Apollinary Hartglas, a Jewish deputy, right, in the Polish parliament, visited Jabłonna camp on September 8th, 1920, one day before it closed. In the archives here at the Archivum Aktonowych, we have a report. It's a 1.5-page report from Hartglas and what his impressions were. Hartglas drew up this report for, what he claims is the following. He was shocked upon his arrival to learn that the soldiers he met, whose families had not brought food, had not eaten for 2 days. This is what he claims, in one of the barracks, Hartglas found plank beds with no mattresses. An engineer Hartglas met, an army volunteer, quote, was impossibly famished, unquote, Hartglas stated. He also reported that relatives were allowed to visit, but only for 15 minutes. Guards would fire shots in the air to notify the relatives after 15 minutes that it was time to leave. The Hartglas report also speaks of a group of Jewish soldiers, he calls them non-intellectuals, who were in civilian clothing and walking barefoot. Walking in groups of 8, each group, according to the report, had 2 Christian soldiers on either side of them who, quote, prodded and cuffed those who were walking slowly from hunger and exhaustion, unquote. Yet, like much of the sources surrounding the history of the Jabłonna camp for Jewish soldiers, for example, the Order of Stosunkowski, the original seems to have been destroyed, Hartglas's report is undated and without his signature. The report is followed by his name, which is typed and no signature, which makes it difficult to verify in terms of authenticity. And the reason is because Hartglas later contradicted entirely his report. In his autobiography written in Jerusalem in the spring and summer of 1950, he wrote with a sense of betrayal about Stosunkowski's order and the Jabłonna camp. Here is his description, however, of that camp. This is the same person who wrote the description I just mentioned. Quote, visiting the camp was allowed. I traveled there on a few occasions to speak with the inmates. Speaking honestly, the inmates in Jabłonna were perfectly fine. They were well fed, they walked freely in the camp, and there was no discipline whatsoever, and there were hardly any exercises. One got the impression that it was more a camp of leisure, unquote. This is the same person who wrote the original document. Now, to be sure, he concluded that the inmates were deeply humiliated and that their internment, quote, strengthened Jewish lack of trust in the promise of equal rights, unquote. Hartglass's autobiographical account is so far at odds with the report preserved in the archives that we may conclude that the report was either not authentic or it was written by another person. Nevertheless, the contents of that original report in the archives itself is consistent with other testimonies, and which suggests worsening conditions during the 25 days of the camp's existence. For example, the number of inmates grew considerably. We recall that in the report of August 29th, the number of inmates was put at approximately 3,000. When the Jabłonna camp was dissolved on September 9th, a report the following day claimed that 17,680 Jewish inmates appeared from the camp. It was perhaps the vast overcrowding that led to deteriorating conditions. Now, testimonies from Jewish inmates often as well mention the problem of food. For example, one volunteer in the Polish army, a Jewish engineer, was brought to Jabłonna, and he wrote a short description of his experience for the Jewish Parliamentary Club on August 28, 1920. Quote, "We have no bread," he wrote. "Food is brought in to us from the outside." The term he used was from the Szecha Akademicka, which is an academic, almost like an academic retreat, or sounds like some students who brought in food from the outside. But he's saying if it wasn't for them, we wouldn't have had bread. Other testimonies emphasize the humiliation and the lack of knowledge about their fate. For example, a group of Jewish soldiers signed a letter, and they signed it Żydzi żołnierze kasher, so I guess observant Jewish soldiers who keep kosher, and they stated, quote, "We are unable to explain even to ourselves if we are soldiers or prisoners. We are not allowed to carry military hats, and they even take them by force for those who have them, or for those who insist on wearing them." Another example I found in the archive is a letter from September 10th, 1920, meaning one day after the dissolution of the camp, but the author was the mother of a 27-year-old soldier who claimed that her son had been beaten and was now bedridden in Jabłonna, and asked for immediate intervention. 2 minutes left. Okay, thank you. Now, another report on the conditions in the Jabłonna camp is that from Dr. Oziasz Ton, a Jewish member of the parliament. And essentially he visited, and what he claimed is that essentially Jews slept on bare stone floors without beds. And then he reported that Jews got daily 1/2 loaf of bread, soup, and porridge. Okay, now let me just, since I only have a few minutes left, let me just say this: that the camp was closed on September 9th, and there were many press reports after the camp, even though the Polish government hoped that it would kind of go away. And what came out in the foreign press reports, especially in the Jewish Chronicle, is that some members, Western Jews, brought the attention to international organizations, the conditions in Jabłonna, and that it went all the way to Rabbi Stephen Weiss in the United States, who then posted some kind of cable to President Wilson on September 10th, 1920. So it appears that the subject of Jabłonna found its way to the desk of President Wilson, who responded to the cable, not mentioning directly at all. So I'm going to now just move to, move to a photograph. This is a photograph of, it's the most important photograph of the Jewish soldiers in Jabłonna. You'll see on the side it says September 7th, 1920, and this is from the famous book, Image Before My Eyes, A Photographic History of Jewish Life in Poland Before the Holocaust, published in 1977, and this is owned by the YIVO Institute. So what I wanted to say is that essentially this is that I'll conclude this way, which is to say that, or ask the question of why the memory, what I want to ask is, why is the memory of this camp, which was 28 days old, in which no Jews were killed, although some, looks like 1 or 2 may have been beaten, why has that persisted to the present day? We can say, and say it may be puzzling why the memory of this camp has persisted in the present day in Jewish collective memory after about the first years of Polish independence, and that it's as prominent in Jewish memory as the pogroms of Lvov, November 1918, the pogrom in Pinsk, April 1919, and the pogrom in Vilna, April 1919, which together saw an estimated 160 Jews killed and many more wounded. The reason is due to this profound symbolic significance of the event. And we can say at the moment of newly independent Poland's greatest existential threat, when the Bolshevik army stood at the gates of Warsaw, the highest military authorities of the Polish state ordered the armed forces to intern their Jewish soldiers, officers, and volunteers out of suspicion that they would side with the enemy out of alleged pro-communist sympathies. To the Jews, to the Jewish community of Poland, the Jabłonna camp was a stinging rebuke of the promise of citizenship and of equal rights in the new Polish state, a wound, we can say, that was never quite healed, almost like the Polish equivalent of the Dreyfus affair. I only just want to say about this, one thing about this photo is it's a very critical primary source, because to give you one example, one report in the Jewish Chronicle claimed, this was about 15 days after the camp was closed, claimed that all Jewish soldiers were stripped of their uniforms, they were in plain clothes, and that they were abused, right? So this is 2 days before the camp was shut down. They don't exactly look abused. They don't look like they've lack of being fed, and also you can see they were obviously in their military uniforms. So the report's saying they were stripped of their, of their uniforms. And there's also one interesting, nobody knows the origins of this, that in the YIVO archives, just last week I found the second image. Is it here? Oh, let's see. How do I go up in the, sorry? Okay, just to show this. Oh, there it is. So this one I found just about 3 days ago in the YIVO archive. Nobody seems to have known about it before, but it's dated September 10th, 1920, which is 1 day after the dissolution, and on the back is written in Polish. I wrote it down, but it's something like Pamiątka bytowania w Jabłonnie, like a memento of our stay in Jabłonna. And it's just interesting that they use the word of our stay as opposed to our internment or our imprisonment. And again, if you just look, there's a lot you can say about that. They do look fine. Now, it's 1 day after. They were probably in a celebratory spirit. They must have just been liberated or freed. So, but again, I believe that it's the bitter legacy that continues. Thank you very much.
We are no worse than them. If you want Jews like these, treat them like these countries do. End of quote. That vehemently stated in 1916, Noach Priludzki, the leader of the Folkist Party in Warsaw Municipal Council, when was blamed for the reason why German Jews are satisfied with civil rights and do not demand simultaneously national rights. Priludzki's assertion is very significant because it links the idea of Polish civil equality with the rights of Polish Jewry as a minority group. We used to interpret personal autonomy in the context of nationalism, a necessary and fruitful framework to understand the phenomenon. However, we frequently neglect its civil aspects. Developing this line of argument, I shall discuss here the connections between Polish views regarding rights for Jews during World War towards November 1918 and the increasingly vociferous Jewish leadership demand for national rights. My claim is that these connections this connection is crucial to understand the increasing popularity of autonomistic ideas and demands amongst Polish Jews around November 1919. It is my contention that in seeking to determine the status of Polish Jewry, the Polish state information oscillated between two conflicting logics. On the one hand, the ethno-national logic. It led to institutionalize a system that promoted ethno-political hierarchy and social inequality that had an essentialist and primordial significance. This logic led to ethnification processes that resulted in the increasing exclusion of the other, including the omnipresent Jew. The above, meanwhile, was accompanied by a universalistic rhetoric of tolerance and equality that merely camouflaged the ethno-national logic, leading to ethno-national hierarchy. Following the ethno-national logic, Jews were excluded from the community of ethno-national sentiments, shaping Jews as one of them. On the other, it pursued another logic, not less important, the logic behind governmentality's principle. The logic sought to include every citizen, including the Jew, under the state authority. It pursued a set of governmentality principles designed to generate conform subjects who both granted legitimacy to the state and was subject to its supervision, whose compliance with the state legitimized its authority and practices by turning him into a compliant subject who both granted legitimacy to the state and was subject to its supervision, transforming then the Jews as one of us, a subject equal to another. So, while the ethno-national exclusionist logic shaped the Jewish population as others, one of them, the governmentality inclusionist logic shaped them as one of us. So that the emerging Polish state constituted the Jewish subject in a gray area between complete equality as one of us and total discrimination as one of them. Despite that different individuals and Jewish groups experience in diverse ways the processes of inclusion on the one hand and discrimination and inequality on the other, I would like to examine here the way in which the Polish Jewish leadership responded to this duality. I suggest that precisely this dichotomy lay at the base of the decline of the Jewish liberal and integrationist camp and concomitant rise of folkist, Zionist, and Bundist autonomist parties. In this sense, the construction of Jewish belonging in Poland during World War I towards November 1919 faced the same quandary as the Polish nation-state. On the one hand, they accepted the ethno-national paradigm state constituting that shaped the Jewish citizens in Poland as a member of a distinctive ethno-national group. On the other hand, they adopted the logic behind the principle of governmentality that constituted the Jewish citizen as equal to others and provided them with the means with which to seek inclusion within the Polish state information as equal subjects. Their goal was to replace the principle of ethno-nationalism as constitutive of ethno-hierarchical state with that of ethno-nationalism as the basis for full and complete equality. I would like to emphasize that the partial civil equality they gained during World War I towards November 1918 served them as a tool with which to fight against the partial civil discrimination under which they suffered in the Polish state information and transformed the Jews from outsiders to insiders. Both the activity of local authorities and municipal councils, as well as the policy as well as the policy of the state authorities, reflect the combination of the two logics, the ethno-national and the governmentality. A tension that I believe created a dynamic that strengthened autonomistic claims. For instance, Jews could be elected to municipal governmental institutions from 1916 onwards. On the eve of the municipal elections in 1916 in Warsaw, Polish political parties negotiated with the Jewish representatives around the question of Jewish representation. The result of the political give and take was the creation of a pattern. In return for inclusion in the evolving political structure, including the Jewish voice in the chorus of Polish claims for independence, the Jews were thus forced to restrict their representation in local government to less than half of their proportion among the city population. This move being designed to maintain ethno-Polish hegemony within the city, since the Jews were clearly regarded as lying outside the pale of Polish national interests. The same dynamic was evident later on the national level. While Jews sat in the Council of the State of the Kingdom of Poland, Rada Stanu Królestwa Polskiego, established in 1918, the first legislative institution created in the emerging Poland, they constituted 8 of the 110 members, only 7% representing 14% of the population of the region. Although theoretically they had an equal voice with all the other members, a query or proposal required the signature of 10 councillors, 2 more than they possessed. In absolute terms, they were also marginalized within the various committees, only 4 of the 92 members in the 9 committees being Jewish, none of them with an autonomistic agenda. This fact evidences their constituting as politically marginal. These committees were the primary fora for promoting and implementing political agendas and discussing in detail laws, regulations, queries, and interpellations. Although as members of municipal councils and later on legislative bodies, the Jewish representation could and did use this platform to decry the discrimination policies this institution adopted, the lack of any jurisdictive bite behind their statements meant that they were merely reduced to verbal protests against the discrimination practiced against them and the community they represented. Frequently, the only response they received was a derogatory dismissal. This logic of governmentality thus offered the Jewish leadership with a degree of political ability to present its demands of equality. However, the ethno-national logic simultaneously ensured that its members could never present them efficiently. While their rights to submit their statements in the plenum were equal to those of others, real possibilities of action on the part of the Jewish delegates were very limited. Their proposals in the plenum were blocked procedurally. Queries were buried in the committees. The situation was therefore that Jews were included in legislative bodies according to the governmentality logic, but they were excluded from effective political action and from executive functions according to ethno-national logic. Autonomistic leaders reflected the adoption of this contradictory logic. They were excluded, reflected the adoption of this contradictory logic. For instance, on several occasions, Priludzki stated, I am quoting, "Politically we are Poles, but from a national perspective we are Jews." Hereby, he sought to sever the issue of equal citizenship from ethno-national affiliation and ensure that the Polish state's governmentality logic of serving all Polish citizens equally would be implemented in practice by adopting the ethno-national principle while rejecting ethno-national hierarchy. Municipal and national practices illustrate the tension between the contradicting logics of governmentality and ethno-nationalism. In the context of this tension, Jewish claims for autonomy became even sharper. For instance, one of the issues discussed by Polish governmental institutions was the procedure for protecting national land against sale to foreigners. a category the Jews fell into in the public discourse. The ethno-national principle thus deprived Jews of equal access to resources. Members of the Jewish community paid for a special tax to be admitted to general hospitals. Or when compulsory education was introduced, although Catholic children were accepted without restriction, a quota was placed on the Jewish community. It is an illustrative example of the contradictory dual logic. In Warsaw, for example, in 1917, 101 schools were open to Jews or in Jewish neighborhoods, reflecting the governmentality logic. But they were 11% out of 881 schools, far less for the 40% of the town's population the Jewish community represented, reflecting the logic of ethno-national hierarchy. Not only less schools, but also more crowded with teachers that receive lower salaries than their Christian counterparts. As Noah Prilutsky explained, right from the early childhood, Jews were thus relegated to a secondary place in the social hierarchy. No less pernicious was the interpretation of a mask of ostensibly liberal universalistic discourse under which discrimination was camouflaged. Jews were discriminated against when serving in the public sector service. Work and rest hours were set universally in accordance with the Gregorian calendar. Jews who wanted to keep Sabbath thus risked dismissal or earning a lower salary. Even when they were prepared to work on the Sabbath, the municipality frequently refused to grant them jobs on the grounds that it did not want to have to deal with the rabbis. Municipal clerkships were only open to those fluent in Polish. Here, too, even if a job brought him into contact with Yiddish-speaking Jews, a Jew was likely not to be employed if not fluent in the Polish language. When in October 1916, Jews built Sukkot on their verandas in representative streets, the police broke into their homes, fined them, and even arrested some, destroying the Sukkot on the grounds that no construction fee had even levied on them. In all these cases and many others, Jews were discriminated against collectively under the mask of the principles of equality and proper governmental functioning, ostensibly without reference to their ethno-national affiliation. The use of universalistic, democratic, liberal rhetoric to preserve the Polish ethno-national ethos and restrict rights undermined the integrationist camp within the Polish Jewish community, an hegemonic political segment during the pre-World War I period. The increasing demands for Jewish autonomy thus arose against the backdrop of socioeconomic discrimination based on ethno-national principles masked under a liberal universalistic rhetoric. Frustrated because of their inability to gain real victories, Jewish delegates were forced to claim and protest rather than working in the committees on mundane affairs confronting big aspirations with everyday reality. That served as a catalyst for even greater confrontation on ethno-national backgrounds. Being a legitimate part of the municipal councils or the legislative, they could protest against discriminatory policies and indeed did so vehemently. But in the absence of being involved in the implementation of the equality they demanded, the Jewish delegates were pushed into the only possibility open to them: vociferous, provocative, and harsh speeches. They received in exchange insults and interruptions. The governmentality logic enabled Jews' inclusion in the legislature as a legitimate representatives, while the contradicting logic of ethno-national state building excluded them simultaneously from the practice of implementing policy as legitimate partners. That goaded ethno-national confrontation and deepened it. Disbarment from state resources, symbolic and real, culture and land, language and public service, being clothed in liberal and universalistic principles, autonomists argued that this rhetoric cancelled concealed underneath in the principle of Polish ethno-nationalism. They thus argued that these should be countered by a similar model, that of the ethno-national Jew. In June 1917, Priludzki declared, I quote, "In this Poland, we demand that the Jewish population be recognized as a national minority group that granted full civil rights and national personal autonomy. This is the only guarantee under which we shall gain equal civil rights," end quote. Only on such a platform could equality, according to his views, only on such a platform could equality of rights and access to public resources be achieved. The Sabbath as the day of rest, recognition of Yiddish and or Hebrew and modern Yiddish culture as that allowing upward mobility. Through recognition, each minority group should be also be granted the possibility of social mobility in a dual process of construction, a differentiated belonging to promise equality. Polish nationalist opposition to the calls for Jewish national rights was based on the ethno-national logic. We will not tolerate any attack on Polish culture, or we will not tolerate separatism, or a Jew by nationality is the enemy of Poland, or complaints against injustice perceived to be intended to damage the Polish cause in the foreign arena. But opposition to the call for Jewish national rights was also based on the governmentality logic, arguing that the Polish state information must socially support integration and ensure blindly equal rights and religious tolerance. That was ostensibly a universalistic rhetoric, but demanded symbolic domination and subordination to the ethno-Polish concepts of state belonging. Both of these rationales, each in its own way, strengthened Jewish demands for autonomy. Increasing numbers within the Jewish community adopted autonomy as the way to fight anti-Jewish discrimination, while Noach Priludzki and others within the autonomy camp were among few calling for minority rights in 1915. By 1918, this platform had become the Jewish political mainstream. Many of those who at the beginning of the war had advocated a conciliatory policy had now moved towards demanding autonomy militantly. Discrimination thus directly led to a radicalization of attitudes. Such, for instance, by February 1918, the Zionist leader Joshua Gottlieb was arguing in a closed party meeting in Warsaw that, I quote, "We demand national rights, but if it appears that the Polish side is willing to compromise, we can forego some of our demands," end quote. Rather than foster compromise and negotiations, however, the increasing efforts to exclude the Jews on the basis of liberal rhetoric did precisely the opposite. In late 1918, the Zionist movement was taken over by a more militant leader, Yitzhak Grumban, coming to rival Priludzki's Folkist party. At the end of the year, even Joshua Gottlieb, hopeless, had joined the voices demanding uncompromising national cultural autonomy. In addition to Priludzki and the Folkists, Grumban, Gottlieb, and the Zionists, and Medem and the Bundists that demanded minority rights before the war broke out, people who had not supported autonomy before the war now also began calling for mechanisms to protect the Jewish minority against the arbitrary will of the majority. Some figures, Samuel Goldflam and Leon Berenson, central figures in Jewish Warsaw so-called neo-assimilationist camp, joined the call for granting Jews some special rights, issuing declarations in support of collective rights to protect the Jews from dispossession. Let me summarize in 1 minute. On the one hand, the policy adopted by the emerging Polish leadership was based on the ethno-national principle that crystallized in occupied Poland prior to Polish independence. This marginalized and excluded the Jews as one of them. On the other hand, the logic of governmentality included the Jew as one of us, granting them, at least formally, a degree of equality. This provided the Jewish leadership with a tool to demand their rights and press for an alternative model of citizenship while exposing the inequality of the system currently in the process of building. I would say, Okay, that's it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much to all three panelists for some rich papers about which there is very much to discuss. I shall try to treat them as a whole, to put some questions to you that you may wish to consider, and to offer some of my own untested observations as a result of reading them. What we have here is three different glimpses into the subject that we are examining. Professor Zilber and Professor Zimmerman have adopted different temporal points of view. Professor Zilber is looking at the issues we're examining forward in time, from the period of what he calls the Polish state in the making. It's an interesting phrase. It actually, I believe, originates with Roman Dmowski in some of his speeches in the Third Duma, where he talks about Poland as государство накануне. Right? Professor Zimmerman is looking backward from a time when a Polish state had already been made and was now defending its existence. Professor Aleksiun straddles both of these temporal perspectives, but she does so from a particular geographical vantage point, right? Galicia, and also from a different social perspective. She's concentrating on strata other than the elites that are the focus of the other two papers. Now, you would think that when you twist the kaleidoscope in this way, you're going to see fundamentally different things. I wonder how much we really do in the end. In my cursory reading of the papers, and in listening to them here, I was actually struck by the similarities. Although I think the question does merit some further examination. I mean, basically in all of these situations, we see Jews of all types, from everywhere on the political and cultural spectrum, contemplating the same phenomenon. That is the transfer of political power from an imperial authority that was located literally and figuratively at some distance, and that did not identify with any particular ethnic community within the region that we're talking about, to an authority that did identify with a particular community and that sought to exercise authority much closer to home. That was a new situation for all of these Jews. It was one that they, or for which they had no historical precedent, no experience, either personal or long-term in terms of their heritage, upon which they could draw. And so we see them contemplating that situation with no small amount of trepidation. Yeah. That trepidation stemmed, in large measure, from the fact that the great majority of Jews in the region had become accustomed to thinking about themselves as an ethnic group in their own right. We see this in all three of the papers. Before the time examined in these papers, Jews had seen their group as more or less equally distant from the center of power in the region, as were all of the other groups with whom they shared space. But now they were facing a situation in which that equality, a very different kind of equality from the one we're usually accustomed to thinking about, was being threatened. Because now one group among many was in the process of acquiring a much greater measure of power than all of the others, and Jews couldn't be sure what to expect. What's interesting to me in thinking about these papers is that it doesn't seem to have mattered a whole lot which imperial power, whether the Russian or the Austrian or the German, was departing the scene. It was the departure itself and the concomitant prospect of one particular local group stepping into the power vacuum that the departure created that was unsettling. Now, one of the propositions that suggests itself from Professor Aleksiun's paper particularly is that it also may not have mattered much which local group was assuming power. I mean, even Jews in Galicia, even those Jews that Professor Aleksiun has talked about that felt themselves very much Polish on many levels, don't seem to have felt especially comforted by the fact that Poles would become the politically dominant group instead of Ukrainians, let's say. What scared them was that any local group was about to replace the imperial authority. So I would like to hear the panelists' thoughts about that proposition. Now, to carry this a little bit farther. For Jews who were contemplating this situation, the basic question was, how should they position themselves to their best advantage? Professor Zilber's paper gives insight into aspects of Jews' thinking before Poles had taken power. Professor Zimmerman's does the same once Poles had taken power, but were still trying to hold on to it. Professor Zilber identifies two strategic goals that are usually perceived as antithetical to one another, but that he sees as complementary. One is the demand for civic equality, and the other for national autonomy. What united them, apparently, and what enabled them to be voiced actually by the same people at the same time, is the argument that whichever local group takes power over from the departing empire, it needs to do so not in its own name, but in the name of all local groups. Right? And indeed, this is true if you look at the platforms and pronouncements of a group that wasn't discussed here, and that is the Partia Równości Obywatelskiej, right? The civil equality party among Jews. Their argument is not, we are Poles of the Mosaic persuasion. It is, we are Jews and we belong to this place just as everyone else does, and whatever government is established has to represent us no less than it represents any of the other inhabitants of this regime. And in that, they were not significantly different from Prudski and the Folkists, from Greenbaum, from any of the others that Professor Zilber has talked about. Now, Jews could do this, they could advance this argument in one of two ways. They could either use the state could either use its power to establish an ethnically neutral regime of the type that Jews understood the Habsburg Empire to have been, rightly or wrongly, right? Or the state could create certain constitutional arrangements that would guarantee each group control over public resources in proportion to its share of the total population. Yeah. Now, from the papers, it appears that Jews advanced one central argument simultaneously in favor of both. And that was that no matter which course the Polish state adopted, it would obviate Jewish anxieties. And that would make Jews so grateful that they would reward the Poles with the support they very much needed to make good on their claim to power among all of the groups that were contending in the same region. And what Professor Zilber has shown is that during the war, the first strategy, the first type of demand to create an ethnically neutral state came to appear less and less viable. But what still isn't clear to me, and not just from your paper, it hasn't been clear to me for 40 years, is why they thought the second strategy, the demand for national autonomy, would be any more effective. Why was this a demand that was worth putting on the table at all? So I wonder if you have any thoughts on that and can solve my long-standing conundrum for me. I never said it would be easy. Professor Zimmerman shows now what happened to a group of Jews that actually tried to give Poles an advance on their loyalty, right? To make a down payment on the promise that they held out should the demand either for ethnic neutrality or for autonomy be met. And what happened is that the highest echelons of the Polish state effectively said to Jews, number one, we don't believe that you're ever going to give us the return that you're promising. And number two, even if you do, it's not really worth that much to us. More likely, we're going to lose from your presence here in Poland more than we'll gain. And in fact, during the 1920s, we begin to see other institutions of Polish society moving more and more to exclude Jews. Say, we will benefit more by keeping you out than by including you in. So here, I think, is perhaps a little more elaborate answer to the question that Professor Zimmerman posed at the end. Why is Jabłonna so prominent in Jewish narrations about the period that we are discussing? Jabłonna basically signaled the failure of all Jewish strategies for claiming a place for themselves in the Polish state and society. So I'll ask Professor Zimmerman, I'll ask all of the panelists, was there any possible Jewish political strategy after 1920 that had any chance of being successful at all? And if so, what was it? I will conclude by adopting Professor Aleksiun's perspective of looking from below and telling the story of one of the Jabłonna internees who didn't see any way to proceed further as a Jew. This is a 19-year-old draftee from an Orthodox Jewish family here in Warsaw. He grew up not very far from this spot that we're on today. His name was Abraham Teitelbaum. 2 years after his release from Jabłonna, he not only adopted a Polish name, but he converted to Catholicism, even though by that time he claimed no religious motivation at all. He simply realized that there was no place in Poland for Jews as Jews. If they wanted to stay in Poland, which he did, they had to become Poles, and in order to become Poles, they had to become Catholics. Nevertheless, he ended up leaving Poland for the United States in the 1930s because he couldn't find employment in his chosen field, despite having a perfectly Polish name and being a Catholic. And it was in the United States that he made a name for himself. The name, that is the Polish name that he chose for himself in 1922, was Alfred Tarski. He was one of the 20th century's most important mathematicians and linguists. He even has an asteroid named after him, which makes me wonder, had he not been at Jabłonna, would we have an asteroid today named Teitelbaum? But more importantly, had the fears that prompted the internment at Jabłonna not taken root and spread to many Polish social institutions, including the universities, maybe the contributions that got Tarski an asteroid named after him might well have been associated with the University of Warsaw and not the University of California. That's what I have to say.
Thank you very much for fascinating papers, fascinating comments, and a fascinating perspective of discussion that will not happen because we don't have so much time to discuss all these issues. So I will ask you for a few questions, and I will ask you for answers that would include also answers to Professor Engel's comments, and hopefully we'll do it in rounds. So we'll collect 6, 5, 7 questions. We will answer, including the comments, and then if there will be time, we'll do the second round. Please.
Pierwszy pan profesor, drugi pan profesor. Oczywiście mogę mówić po polsku, bo tak łatwiej mi będzie. Proszę Państwa, ja się nazywam Grzegorz Nowik, jestem profesorem Instytutu Studiów Politycznych Polskiej Akademii Nauk i od blisko 30 lat, 28 po transformacji zajmuję się badaniem dokumentów wojny Polski z bolszewicką Rosją. I jeśli Państwo pozwolicie, to drobny kamyczek, przyczynek do kwestii referatu profesora Zimmermana o Jabłonnie, jeśli wolno. Więc po pierwsze chciałem powiedzieć, że no, trudność jest z nazwaniem tego, czym była Jabłonna. To były koszary wojskowe, a więc obszar, do którego wchodziło się za przepustką i wychodziło się za przepustką. Nie był to żaden obóz, proszę Państwa. W tych samych koszarach i w tym samym miejscu formowały się pułki ochotnicze, które wyszły przed kilkoma dniami, przed tym skoncentrowaniem tam, zebraniem żołnierzy polskich wyznania mojżeszowego w tym obozie. W tym samych koszarach również formowały się wcześniej pułki legionowe, które w 19 roku poszły na front wschodni. To jest jedna bardzo istotna konstatacja, więc...
Panie profesorze, niestety mamy bardzo mało czasu, więc musimy...
Ale jedna istotna, to muszę to powiedzieć, proszę Państwa. Otóż my musimy również zbadać, ponieważ nie znamy generalnego kontekstu i nie znamy tych dokumentów. My te dokumenty, proszę Państwa, otwieramy z teczek, które od lat 20. były nieotwarte i nieodpakowane. Proszę Państwa, jest również w posiedzeniu Rady Obrony Państwa taki fragment, który mówi o dramatycznej sytuacji nad Choryniem pod Ostrogiem, kiedy część pierwszej Brygady Rezerwowej, formowanej właśnie w Warszawie,
Panie profesorze,
poddała się.
Nie możemy naprawdę
proszę Państwa,
czasu
to jest
innym
bardzo
osobom.
istotne ja zakończę za chwileczkę. I w tej brygadzie, jako że formowana była w Warszawie, znaczny odsetek stanowili żołnierze właśnie żydowscy, poborowi żydowscy. Trzeba brać pod uwagę ten kontekst historyczny. Ja nie będę się rozwijał, bo widzę, że przewodniczący nie pozwala na to. Trzeba brać pod uwagę ten kontekst, w którym istniała realna obawa, że nasycenie takimi żołnierzami jednostek, które bronią przedpola Warszawy, no, spowoduje sytuację analogiczną, jaka zaistniała nad Choryniem pod Ostrogiem, kiedy po prostu część brygady rezerwowej poddała się. I jeśli dalej nie mogę, to pozostałe wątki pominę. Dziękuję bardzo.
Dziękuję bardzo. Pan profesor Wurber, proszę.
In this context, I'm not asking my question.
Okej. W takim razie Chris Hart-Henschel, proszę.
I also wanted to refer to Professor Zimmerman's paper. First of all, I would like to agree with you that Jabłonna was not a camp. It was on the territory of the Jabłonna garrison. And if we talk about the living conditions there, there are reports even before the Jews were interned there that the living conditions were very, very poor. So we have to look at the context of the army and how the material situation was in the army at this time as well. And then I want to add that the argumentation of the government in public after the internment of the soldiers was published in the press was to protect Jews against the anti-Semitic reactions of the population in the war in the fighting area. So it is very interesting that the Polish government used this argument that they wanted to protect Jewish soldiers in this very situation. And the last aspect I wanted to mention.
Excuse me, are you saying that they argued that they interned Jewish soldiers in Jabłonnie in order to protect them? Is that the argument?
Yes,
okay.
There are press communiques which say this.
Okay.
And the last aspect is that we have to distinguish between the normal soldiers and officers interned there because they were treated differentially.
Thank you very much, Professor Blobom.
Yes, first of all to Josh, the photograph of the officers and soldiers in uniform 2 days before they were released, you might also think that earlier that they had been stripped of their uniforms, and then those uniforms were restored to them, on the eve of their release, knowing that they would be released. As for Professor Silber's presentation and interpretation, I entirely agree. I think that is a very, very good reading of Jewish thinking, especially Palutsky's thinking during this period before the end of the war. I would disagree about the Polish acquisition of power. They had acquired certain limited powers, if not state sovereign power, especially in a city like Warsaw. They have police powers, right? Power over municipal appropriations, and other kinds of powers that Jewish parties and individuals used to protest against in the era of discrimination. I think we need to talk about what kind of autonomous Palutsky was. That is, he was a territorial one. He was a Jewish nation builder where Jews actually lived, as he put it, and not in Palestine, which he once referred to as a Hebrew relic. And then, I don't know, David's question, why did Jews think autonomy could be an effective demand or an effective political strategy? Or did Jews have any possible effective political strategy? I think that autonomy, and I think you would agree with this, was the only possible way to achieve civil rights. The two things were connected. And if they didn't get equal civil rights, they couldn't get autonomy. If they didn't get autonomy, they couldn't get equal civil rights.
Thank you. We have still, Dr. Janicka, please. We have still one more. And I ask you to be brief because we want to give our speakers time to answer.
Great. So, first of all, I mean, not only Jews were considered as suspicious, potentially suspicious soldiers. The same concern of the Polish elite, I mean, referred as well to the Polish peasants. Yes, and the Polish peasants, so the minority of the society, were promised agrarian reform. Yes, that has never occurred during between the two wars. And as for the voice of Professor Nowik, I think that anti-Semitic perspective is not a legitimate perspective here and nowhere else, because your assumptions are clearly in that order. I mean, of that kind. The second thing, as for the autonomy question, I wonder if there was no relation between the fact that civil rights were imposed upon Poland and the Poles by the Minority Treaty of Versailles. So, because very often people, for instance, who didn't speak English, Yiddish, declared Yiddish as their native language in order to be counted into this minority group. I mean, the question was addressed extensively by Mendelssohn and many others, Anna Landau-Czajka. So it was a strategy of inscribing themselves into the minority group in order to force the authorities to execute, to respect the minority treaty, which was, by the way, I mean, which Poland withdrew from in 1934. That's it.
Thank you.
Very
Please.
much.
Dr. Nowak, there in the back. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I wanted to ask Professor Aleksiun about this reconstruction of a Habsburg past and an imagination of the Jewish place in society. How much is that the specific form of the memoir? How much does it actually something that I'm struggling with myself? How much is it actually telling us about the immediate situation? Because in my experience, when you look at the immediate documents, on the one side, there's a lot of disappointment with the Habsburg Empire for letting Jews down during the war. There's a lot of enthusiasm for Polish independence, which is then also very often disappointed. And what I also can see in many cases is basically, without many problems, a transfer of loyalties and of rituals, especially, I think, from Vienna to Warsaw. And appeals to Pilsudski that before were made in a very similar language to the emperor in Vienna, for example. So this was one point, and connected to that, also this question of loyalty and this unbreakable connection between the Habsburg Empire and the Jews. I mean, in the last years, it had been really challenged for a number of other national groups within the Habsburg Empire, and saying that especially the war and the failure of the imperial authorities broke this relationship, this basically societal contract. How far is that also true for the Jews in that context?
Thank you. Maybe one last question, because we'll not have a second turn. So Professor Poloński, please, and I think you will answer then.
Well, I'd like to address the question that David Engel raised, which is, after Jabłonna, was there a successful political strategy for Jews in Poland? And in a way, I'm reminded of the well-known Irish joke, when the farmer is asked how to get to Dublin, he said, "I wouldn't start from here." I'm not going to defend what happened in Jabłonna, although this is an issue which needs to be discussed. But this is something that took place at a moment of great national crisis, and similar actions have been taken elsewhere. Internment of people, Jewish refugees in Britain in 1940 would be a similar example. I think that one needs to look at the period of the 1920s if one's talking about political strategies, and there were a number which did emerge and perhaps were made irrelevant by the Great Depression. But on the one hand, the strategy of people like Leon Reich to talk about Galicia, that is to say, We do not want to stress our common links with the other national minorities in Poland with whom we don't have much in common. They either want territorial autonomy or they want to secede. What we need is the rights which are granted to us by the Constitution, which was much more important in this context than the National Minorities Treaty and the National Minorities Treaty. And on this basis, the Reich sought both an agreement with Grabski and then subsequently with Pilsudski. And then whatever one can say about Aguda, they did have a political strategy which up to a point worked. Now, why the strategies failed in the 1930s, particularly after 1935, is another matter. And whether, had the Polish-German conflict in some ways gone away, a counterfactual argument, obviously, one might have returned in some ways to a greater accommodation. There was this brief Polish-Jewish honeymoon after the Germans repudiated the Polish-German non-aggression treaty. I could speak for much longer. I won't annoy Kamil by
Not
doing
me.
so.
Thank you, please.
Oh.
Yeah, you may answer.
Should we just do
Your
goodbye?
time to respond.
As you wish, really.
Okay, I was first, and my name starts with A, so I'll be first. I wish I could solve Professor Engel's dilemma of 40 years. I agree with Professor Polonsky that we obviously have this knowledge of how futile versus various strategies turn out to be, and I would add also, especially in the late 30s, contacts among Polish and Polish Jewish intelligentsia surrounding the democratic clubs, which exactly promoted the idea of civic inclusion. But 1918 is certainly a very much of a breaking point. Now, breaking point from which then experiments are made. Now, to your observation about how starting in various places, regionally or not, we seem to arrive at a very similar discussion, I agree and I disagree, and I think that there is a very distinct difference in what Galician Jews are starting with and what other Jews who become Polish Jews are starting with. And so for that particular region, much more is at stake in a mode of losing rather than hopes, anxious hopes, but hopes nevertheless. So I think that that there is a difference, although they end up experiencing much of the same marginalization and exclusion, of which Jabłonna is a prime example. And I was actually surprised when I was preparing this paper that when looking at the early weeks and months of Jewish press from Galicia, how little there seems to be those full of pathos, expected pronunciations of patriotism, loyalty, fervor, and enthusiasm, because precisely they're starting from the point in which this removal of the imperial context puts them very clearly in a disadvantage, which goes to your fantastic question. This is sort of caught me in flagranti, because I have this anxiety as well about the nostalgia that is formulated from the perspective of decades later, and I have very little of things written in the moment. However, what people seem to be writing, especially in the press, and then the press is a public pronunciation, so of course needs to be treated cautiously. Again, there seems to be a great awareness of, yes, there was a lot of criticism about how Habsburg Empire treated Jews and how it fell apart, and how this contract didn't turn out to be the way it turned out to be. But in light of what was happening on the ground in the fall of 1918, with violence, with employment policies shaping up in front of people's eyes. I think that the Habsburg past was gaining fantastic reviews, precisely in contrast of what the reality that was shaping up. So I absolutely agree with your call for caution, but I would still hold to the position that I presented.
Okay. Just if we have a question for one of the other, do we ask that after we make our?
No, you answer just all the questions and comments.
Oh, sorry. Okay, so can I begin my comment with a question to Professor Aleksiun, which I loved her paper, and given my interest in Pilsudski, you mentioned the photograph. The question is in 1920 or 1921, this family replaced their photo of Franz Josef with Pilsudski. You seem to suggest that it was not a genuine decision, but some tactical one. Were you implying that there was no sense that in 1922, was it, that Pilsudski was in some ways the new protector, or in some ways not, these Jews were not genuinely attached to him because he was known among Jews as a kind of protector of the Jews and kind of very. So I wasn't sure if you were saying it was untact, not if it was a decision that was not genuine. So if you can answer that afterwards. So just on my comment, or maybe why don't you answer now? Can you answer now?
No, let's.
Okay. So I want to just start with the discussions of Jabłonna. First of all, about Alfred Tarski, which is so fascinating that you mentioned him, one of the Jabłonna inmates who becomes this famous professor at UC Berkeley. He was called the Alfred Einstein of the West Coast, I believe. The Einstein of the West Coast, but he was a good friend of Czesław Miłosz's, and in Miłosz's very important work from 1999, which was a discussion in the 1920s, he makes reference to his colleague and friend Tarski, and he quotes a song that the Jabłonna soldiers sang. So I thought that was really an important comment. Going back, just an answer to your comment, in the discussion at the time in orders, I have never saw any discussion that said we're doing this to protect the Jews. I just want to say that that was new to me, that you were saying about the conditions of the camp. It could very well that there were poor conditions to begin with. And one thing I wanted to say is that my interest is in establishing what are the facts about the camp, the conditions, but then also contemporaneously, what was the impact on Jewish life in Poland? How was it thought of? And then why has the memory persisted? And I just want to say, to give you an example, there's Józef Lichten, who in 1981 wrote an essay about the 1920s. He was a 14-year-old schoolboy, Jewish schoolboy in Warsaw at the time, and he wrote in 1981, looking back, he said, quote, Jabłonna was the first realization in my early youth that Jews were treated as others, perhaps even as foreigners, at a time when we thought of ourselves as an integral part of the Polish state and its society. He says, so when I speak or write about Jabłonna, I am deeply saddened at the thought of those youthful ideals that were dashed, unquote. So I think he probably represents that young generation of Jews. And then about about the persistence of memory. And one of the could be the power of imagery, that we have this photograph that I showed you, just to give you a sense that it's repeated. It's at this museum, in the Polin Museum, in the permanent exhibition of the interwar period. We have the Jabłonna photograph. It's in the 2014 catalog history of the Polin history catalog of this museum. In 2015, in Professor Szymon Rudnicki's book, Jews in the Polish Parliament, second edition, the photograph is included. And in 2018, William Hagen of UC Davis just published his book, Anti-Jewish Violence in Poland, 1914 to 1920, and that figures prominently, the photograph itself. And I just have this feeling of, if there's been, and since we're at the museum, I believe 1.4 million visitors since its founding, its opening and ceremony in 2015. So if 1.5 million visitors have at least glanced at that photo, I think they don't just glance at the photo, there's something striking about it when you read the caption.
It's very marginalized, though.
Sorry?
It's marginalized, the photo.
It's preempted, and the caption preempts the...
Oh,
right, true. If you just saw the photo, I don't think you would find it as unusual, but yeah, the photo, there's something striking about it. And I just think there's something about the persistence of that. And that Yivo book from 1977 was reprinted in a 25th anniversary edition. I think it's a popular gift for bar mitzvah and bat mitzvahs. But I think at that time, and I think it's because it's such a beautiful photographic history, a lot of people own it as it's a staple part of a Judaical library, in my view, and at least in America. So in other words, I think the persistence has to also do with the power of imagery. Thank you. I'll stop there.
Okay, I will be very, very telegraphic. I will begin. I will, in any case, be very telegraphic. It is better for you. The first, and I will say it. I will use some of those arguments were made during this morning. The first is context, 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 and the second, sorry for using another Polish language, which is Yiddish. I do not. You will translate it in better than me. Wie es Christus sich hat, so Jidus sich. Yes.
What happens with Christians happens with
Jews. That means that what I am trying to say with this both sentences that this process of ethnification was very, very empowered and empowering and going and escalating among non-Jews, and what do you expect from the Jews? That is the first one. Neutrality was impossible. Ethnification was in the rise. The escalating radicalization of the main Polish parties was even it was not expressed in all its radicalization because of the German occupation. Konrad wrote about it. If not the German, the situation would be worse in Congress Poland. The point is that in 1917, 1918, the perception of the Jewish Polish leadership was that this autonomy in Ukraine is working good. The perspective was also similar in Lithuania. The demands were less contested there, and they supposed that it would be work. The following strategy, which you did not mention, but you know about it better than me because you wrote about it, that the international protection, that was the next strategy, which we know that it collapsed and did not work, because there are not, I would say, eternal answers to this question. It was always situational, like patriotism or loyalty is situational, because when 1916 we see these big Jewish leaders joining these patriotic manifestations, we have to understand that the patria, the Poland they have in their mind was different than the patria of others. They were patriotic towards their own fantasy of Poland. 1918, Poland was in the making. It was open for them. All the possibilities were ostensibly open that they could try to apply it for them. That's, I think that I took all my minutes.
Thank you. Natalia, you want to answer for Professor Zimmerman's question in 3-4 words? Or?
In four words. I think that this is not even a category, whether or not they were, what was the adjective you used? That they were...
it was a tactical.
Yeah, that it was tactical. I think that first of all, it's not dated. It comes from the daughter's memories of growing up. Okay. So she only says, sometime in the early 20s this occurred. And I take it as a symbolic gesture of transfer of loyalty, and the role of Piłsudski is seen in the kind of similar categories in which Franz Josef was such a wonderful emperor and friend to Jews in Jewish imagination. But yes, I think that there is an element of No, he was thought as a more positive possibility of all possibilities that were available, not only after his death, but before. But there is an element of strategic shift which occurs in the situation in which this family and many others are vulnerable. Now, this is a family that is speaking German at home. I think it's even more important to have the right emperor on a wall in your living room. But I don't think it needs to be seen as some kind of fake gesture.
Sure,
it's simply a complex situation in a very complex time.
Maybe they liked you.
No,
well, that's what I
think it's quite likely that they did. Yes.
That's what I think.
Thank you very much for this fascinating panel, and I am very sorry, not being sorry, I asked for your empathy, being so harsh on time, but because of that we have now 1 hour break, this is 1 hour break, and we will... And 3:30 we reconvene. Thank you very much.
Thank you.